So what I did was, I just wrote down like a stream of consciousness notes on my past month of working with Claude, and I'll just work off of that. Um, okay, let's see. Okay, so one of the most important things I found is that we have to restrain the model. Um, okay, well, let me preface by saying that I don't use cursor. I just use the Claude web UI, and you know I'm sure I mean, we're just at the beginning of, natural language programming. So I'm sure there's lots of optimizations to do. And I'm not saying my setup is optimized. I just got into the weeds and, things were working. So I just, kept going. Um, so restrain the model. If you notice, when you jump into a chat with Claude and you say, I'm working on this, I'm working on that, it'll just start spitting out code and it'll just start generating for you, right? Um, I think that has the potential of poisoning the context. So what I do is I have the system prompt is it's very simple, and I mean I've seen very detailed system prompts out there where people literally put in an entire what you would find as like a job description that you give to like to hire an engineer, and they put that as a system prompt. And I haven't tested that yet. Um, just, what I found working, I just went with it. So, for example, the first line is convex, TypeScript, remix, just setting the stage for what I'm looking for and what I'm working with. And then I say, do not write code until given the directions to do so. Before writing code, we need to thoroughly discuss and assess the totality of what's involved. We need to have a back and forth with you asking me questions to help you understand, and me asking you questions to help me understand. And this is just a quality of life thing. I say, when you give me the code to implement, I will need you to precisely tell me where to insert the code blocks. Because I mean, obviously, I'm not using cursor. So, so overall, what that does is I describe to Claude what I'm looking for in terms of the feature. And okay, so even before we get there, I should go back a bit and say when I'm working with Claude, in my situation, the situation I'm talking about is working with Claude on a project from scratch, not on an existing project. So in the beginning, I treat Claude like a junior engineer that has to be handheld. Because if you don't do that, Claude will just do whatever it wants to do. You need to restrain it. You need to restrain it in the beginning. And for me, restraining what that looks like is defining the schema as much as possible for the project beforehand, or Claude will fill it in. Now, I'm not saying that you can't do a back and forth session with Claude to come to a schema, but this is just how I started. So I start off with treating Claude like a junior engineer that needs to be handheld on everything. And so then when we're doing these back and forth question and answer, conversations, I'm telling it this is what I need, and it's just to give a high level way of I'm treating it like I would treat someone that I was working with.
Mhm.
That's just like that. But there's some assumptions you can make when working with the human that you can't make with the model, and that's with the context. What context does Claude have? So I'll go. So what I do is in the beginning, I load because there's a lower amount of files. I just load up the entire code base into the Claude projects context, and I work with Claude from there. So after I get that first system prompt out, I say to Claude, "Tell me, what do you see?" Just to one, it gives me a summary of what is, where is the code base at just then and there, and then it also tells me like, okay, is the logic there? Is enough logic there for Claude and me to work on this? So, I mean, then after that, it really is just going through a question and answer session where Claude feels like it has enough information to implement. And I let Claude decide when it feels it has enough information to implement. And that's going through the question and answers, considering all the angles. And a lot of times even when I'm treating it like a junior developer, it will act as a senior developer and come up with considerations that I'm not even thinking about that are important. And for those, I'll say, I mean, when I'm answering the question, I'll be like, oh, we'll circle back on that. So, and what I plan on doing is exporting my Claude chats and making a backlog of all those things that I said, oh, we're gonna circle back on it. So
Okay.
yeah, so far, I mean, with this back and forth method, um, you know, just let's say in 2 weeks, um, me and Claude have built up and look, a robust backend, about 8,500 lines of code, maybe about 10 tables, 30, 40 functions, and I mean, just to give a context, on my last project, we had about like 8 contractors working on it. Most of them were senior. Um, a $500,000 budget was spent on that project, and I I mean, compared to you know compared to what contractors cost on that project, like I'm talking with Claude, I was able to get. I told Matt, like 2 to 3 months of work done, and it would have cost I would say approaching six figures. What I'm saying is what output that we have, because also the output, the code that is working on is also a domain specific thing. To be able to find people out there that can write the code and also understand the business logic involved in this specific project, it's going to be expensive. It's going to be difficult to find these people. Um, but also that being said, I mean, I was all working with Claude 8 to 12 hours a day as well.
Mhm.
So there's no pretension here of you see on Twitter, people just, oh, I made this in 20 minutes. Like, no, it's not that. It's we're still doing programming, but it's not syntax programming anymore. It's natural language programming. You know, I would say, and look, I know with programmers, there's a cohort of programmers where they love writing syntax, and I understand that, and I see the arts, and but I feel like who should use AI is if if you can write the requirements that need to be implemented, the control flow that needs to be implemented, if you can write that faster than you can write syntax, then I don't understand why you would write syntax. Other than, you know, for the love of it. But if we're talking about delivering on business value, time is, of the essence, right? So, okay, so restrain
Yeah,
the
and
yeah,
just to give some context, you mentioned you got Claude to the state of like 800 lines of code, 30 convex functions.
8,500
I,
lines of code. Yeah,
sorry, what?
8,500.
Oh, 8,500. Yeah, that sounds more that sounds more right. I think Clarity Text is like about in that neighborhood. What I would say is at, we I was using Claude as well, like Claude.ai, the web application when it was coming out, and I would often hit into the context cache limits, especially as I uploaded more files and code. So, could you talk about like now that you're at this state of this code level is no longer a green field? What are some of those tools that may be helpful for you? I think you mentioned some in our direct messages, like and like how do you manage that context at this level of code base?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So there's new tools coming out where they use basically knowledge graphs and like algorithms like tree sitter to essentially find what are the relationship between functions in your code base. And then when you're asking, oh, like when you're saying in natural language, I want to work on this feature, these algorithms like tree sitter will only load into context those functions that it maps has a relation to your natural language. So, for example, one project that does this very well is called CodeBuff. They use a tree sitter algorithm, but even before CodeBuff, you had IDER, AIDER, which also they were the ones who actually innovated on using the tree sitter algorithm. And I'm actually surprised Cursor doesn't use tree sitter. Cursor actually makes embeddings of your code base, which is, I guess that can also work. But I think there might be some more efficiencies with with the tree sitter. I'm not sure, but so anyways, so once the code base gets bigger, yeah, context management is really important here. Um, so I think also besides using these tools, as you get more familiar with the code base, I think you can also just like have a muscle memory for knowing which files are necessary to load in for this feature that you're
Yeah.
working on. And but if you don't if you don't want to rely on muscle memory, you can use like so for example, you could just you could go to CodeBuff and say which files are related to this feature, and that high level description will tell it'll output, it's these, and then you could even say, draw me um like a graph showing the relationships, you so that helps to cut down context, um, to load in other environments. But you could also just, go ahead and just also use CodeBuff directly too.
Yeah.
So I mean, other than CodeBuff, you have CodeBuff, you have Aider, you also have Klein, which I haven't used yet. But Klein is known for really like spending tokens, really. And then so I mean, overall, there has been a huge uptick in a new generation of AI coding tools that I've seen, and yeah, one big thing is it's the whole context problem that they're working on.
And let's talk about some context specific AI tips because I think that's the thing that's really gonna like set us on a new trajectory. Because with like the Claude AI web app and some of these tools, like we can all generally read the mainstream news and documentation and like be clever. But what you've done in terms of using a CLI tool to actually troubleshoot convex functions, stack traces, I think that's really impressive. So if that's something that you can show us or share your screen or like walk us through, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so on CodeBuff, I used up my credits for the month. So
Okay.
yeah, like I can't show a demonstration, but they do have free credits that you guys could easily check it out. But essentially, you can tell CodeBuff after you're done editing the files, do npx configs dev and look at the errors and fix any errors. Um,
And then
but
how do you like get code buff to index convex documentation, like their knowledge base, like the Discord server, or like how does it have either rag or context about convex?
yeah, so in with CodeBuff, in your project directory, you can create markdown files that end in .knowledge.md, and it'll read those files. So you could have convex.knowledge.md and have all your, convex, what you wanted to know about convex in there. And you could just have it in one knowledge.md, but they do allow you to partition it that way. Um, but also, but to reduce what I've seen with Claude in terms of errors on convex, it's really where it doesn't declare types, and so that's just that's just a matter of once you get a pattern down into your code base and saying to it, just follow the patterns I already have, you know. So um yeah, another thing with I could say on the convex is um okay, yeah, so the biggest thing again, it's for us, it's type errors, where it doesn't declare the types. Oh, actually, we're talking about all of the, the great things about the AI. One thing that I have to say is one problem that I see is the only thing I could complain is sometimes if it's a huge code block, it'll omit things, and it won't tell you that it omitted it. Sometimes it will. Sometimes, like let's say, I mean, not scientifically saying it, maybe like 1 out of 10, it'll omit something. So you have to you have to stay on top of that. Sometimes Claude will just omit things, and
Like omit
that's
things
the
in your
only
prompt,
thing that
or
I can complain about. Yeah.
omit things in your prompt, or omit things in your markdown file, or both?
No, no, in the code output.
Oh.
that it's
Okay.
outputting. It'll omit things that I'm saying that were already there.
Mm. Like code comments, I've had an issue with that, where it admits the code comments, even though they're valuable, it'll just like take them out. So I had to add it to the system prompt to say that, maintain all code comments.
Yeah, definitely. And is that through the web interface?
Similar, yeah. Well, I'm using cursor, so I added to the cursor rules. Um,
Interesting. Okay, okay. Yeah, okay, okay. So in the beginning, I mean, this is more of a quality of life thing. In the beginning, when I started the project, I didn't really organize the functions semantically into different folders. I just went straight to just creating what I needed, and eventually I had like 10 files with thousands of lines of code, and it's not organized, right? So I mean, I had Claude semantically organize it, and I'm saying like group the functions, these functions under this heading, and it's just absolutely beautiful what it did. And then I took and then obviously after you rename all your functions and whatnot, you have to update the references in your code, right? So I took the diagram that Claude gave me of the new um updated folder structure, and then I gave it to CodeBuff saying, "Look, we updated all of our files. I need you to go through all of the files and update the references." And it did that in 30 minutes. And I mean, a person can do that definitely in a couple of hours. I would say it's tedious. They have to be really careful in making sure they got everything. But just the CodeBuff doing that in Claude doing that in such a short amount of time perfectly was amazing, but obviously I think it's best to start with the right patterns from the beginning and not clean things up later. But if you're in that situation, Claude can really help you clean things up. And beside cleaning things up, another thing is in this project I didn't establish I didn't do anything with auth or authorization at the beginning because I just wanted to get to the meat of what this project is about, right? But then eventually I had to go back and add authentication and add authorization. So I was able to use Claude to create a Node.js script that would go through every function and then generate me a report of, you know, is this an internal function? Should it be an internal function? Is this a public function? Should it be a public function? And then once we got that, I was able to systematically add admin auth routes and authorization again using CodeBuff with that security report. And I mean, if I had to do that on my own, it would have been tedious, and I'd be like second guessing, like, did I get everything? But the fact that the model can hold the memory of every line of code that's there, you can really trust um, what it's doing. 9 out of 10 times.
And what makes CodeBuff important in that particular task where you're evaluating every function for like should it be public or private? Like, is CodeBuff's usefulness in workflow state management? Like, you have hundreds of functions. You're not going to be able to one shot through that, so you need to hold some state about like these functions have already been evaluated.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, okay, CodeBuff. The My reason for using it is that I do not have to specify context. It finds the context based on the natural language descriptions that I give it. But as far as state management, um, yeah, like sometimes I'll be working with Claude and I'll say to Claude, you know, give me a detailed summary so I could pass off this task to another engineer, and then that engineer will be code buff. So that's picking up the baton, let's say. But as far as um, yes, yes, definitely. CodeBuff does provide a great state management as far as having all of. Well, I mean, Claude does that too, but okay, I would say it's that it's not having to specify context is where CodeBuff really shines. You don't have to do it at all, really. It will find the context for even very complex things. It's very impressive in the way they've implemented tree setter.
Okay. So are you saying like CodeBuff is better at indexing your repo better than like say Cursor and Windsurf is? And the fact that they can have both that value proposition and being in the CLI, that's why essentially you use CodeBuff?
Yeah, so I haven't really used Cursor too much. I just don't like
Okay.
VS Code. So, but when I did use Cursor, I noticed that I had to specify the files, right? Is,
There's two things. When it comes to the convex documentation, you specify the URL to the documentation, and then for the repo, I think it just automatically, by virtue of the fact that you've opened the folder, they're assuming that's the repo you're working with. That's my understanding of how it works.
so you don't have to specify specific files for context in Cursor?
People used to do that. Like Tom Redmond from Convex Incorporated said, like he had a dot cursor rules file where he did something similar to your Markdown file. But in other people's experience in the community, they did the dead simple thing of just pasting in the stack.convex.dev URL and the convex dev documentation, and it was essentially the same effect.
I see. I see. No, I mean the specific functions that are necessary for that edit you're working on. Like, don't you have to
Oh,
specify
okay.
those files?
So
In
I
Cursor?
think there you have less control. You have a prompt, you have the space to do a prompt, but you can like essentially do an at mention of files. But it's your responsibility to do that
Right,
and
right,
mention the correct files.
right. So with
I've
con,
been finding I've been finding too to like co-locate related code in a folder, and then I'll at the directory and basically give it the context of the directory. So kind of keeping everything co-located seems to work pretty well as well.
yeah, definitely. I mean, having the proper organization just changes everything.
When you say co-located, are you talking about like the directories of the files in your repo, or like
Yeah. So
can you
say
give
if
an
I'm
example of
working on
that?
so say if I'm working on something like related to like printing, um, anything related to printing, I'll keep co-located in like a printing folder. So I guess sliced by feature essentially. Um, so yeah, everything related to that would be in that printing folder. Um, does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah, it does. It actually reminds me of something that our Clarity Text team was discussing this week, actually, because for the first time, we're defining tables outside the schema.ts file. So maybe
Yeah.
you've run into this problem where like your schema.ts file is going to eventually get enormous, right? Like if you're on a traditional project, your DDL for a traditional relational database is like a huge list of tables.
Yeah.
So do you keep growing and appending tables to that defined schema function
I
in your
do, but
schema.ts, or
uh,
do you
uh,
divide it up and put it?
well, I'm quite interested in components for the private components, the private convex components. Like they're not really fully developed yet, but like that's one thing that I think will help address this issue a lot, where you can then again split by feature, but having the back end table, all the related code for maybe the front end, etc., related in like the component. When I say component, I mean like the back end schema of the convex component, but also the front end of the React component or the even the hooks or things like that. Instead of having a hooks folder, having everything there, in that one printing folder. I think I find is more effective.
So just to be clear, right now in your code base, you have a domain divided organization, but still all your tables are still in the same defined schema function in one
Correct. Yeah.
huge schema TS file.
Mostly. So I use Zod. So I define all my schema in Zod, and then I'll use the Zod schema, a reference to that in my convex my convex schema.ts file. So a lot of the logic is sort of outside of that schema. It's defined in kind of another folder that I have as schemas, and that's kind of shared with the front end as well. So that then gives me the end-to-end type safety, because I have the front end referencing that schemas folder as well, but also the convex schema.ts is pulling in all those Zod schemas to then create the tables. So yeah, it is all one file essentially, though, like because you have to, like, I guess, define it in that schema.ts file for convex to define the tables.
Yeah, I think this is like interesting research question because like if you had your Zod tables defined along with like say your within that printing directory, would your AI responses be better? I think that's the research question at hand.
Well,
Yeah.
in my view, I think the schemas are one of the most critical parts to feed the AI. Like Omar was trying to describe, like or he mentioned around the types and the issue with types. And I think one solution to that I've found is giving it the schemas. So I always give it the Zod schema. It's like one of the critical parts of the context that I make sure is always included in the prompt. So yeah, that schema file like is an essential part, I think.
Yeah, Jamal, like if we put our tables in our separate domains, I guess we have to hope / rely / trust that Cursor is able to comprehend to go to that directory that it's imported from and make sure that it comprehends the whole schema. Or
well, I just at schemas. So like I'm using Windsurf mostly now, and I'll yeah, if I've got something that it's kind of needs for the feature, I'll just reference the schemas folder, and it will just pull in that whole, because it then knows the relationship between all the other tables as well, because usually there's some relationships or something that are needed. It just gives more context, and it's not that much extra information. So I think it's a really good value for the downside of potentially burdening the LLM with too much context that it gets confused. I don't think it really does that with the schemas because they're very explicit and around like what is needed. So I think that level of explicitness is very helpful for the LLM basically.
yeah, so I think that's my point, because I think we are at Clarity Text about to lose that convenience, because you can just do a simple at mention of one file, and then if we continue as we are, we have our schema TS, but we also have like our messaging specific tables in a different file, and then we'd have to mention both, I guess. We need to think that through and like how that impacts our code. And then the trade-off on your end is like you're feeding lines into the context that may not be necessary. If like your schema TS file is like 1,000 lines long or something like that. But maybe that's fine. Maybe in a few months, like 1,000 line schema TS file is fine.
I think it's kind of like thinking as the LLM as like a human. I think is a good way to think about things. So like, would a human get confused if you fed it like too many schema files? And like, probably not really, because again, it's very explicit. Like, I think where the LLM gets confused is when you give it too much context and there's potentially conflicting information around, oh, should it be this way or this way? Like, you've used this pattern over here, but over here you've used this pattern. Like, which pattern is actually the right pattern that you would like me to use? I think that's where the LLM tends to get tripped up, in my experience.
Okay. And you mentioned something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Omar.
Yeah, to add to this conversation, this was actually in my system prompt at the bottom, and I forgot to mention it. I say to Claude, note, if you think you need to see other files than the ones you have access to, please say something before assuming what those files look like or creating code that overwrites them. So, that helps in the situation of maybe I missed some context to load into it, and Claude can infer what other files does it want to see, and then it'll ask me for those files, and that helps because otherwise, Claude will just make up what it thinks should be there, and then we have to go back and forth. So that's another thing of restraining the model is telling it not to assume anything and to ask you for more information. So again, just goes back to treating it like a person, you know, like how you would work with a person.
And one thing I want to clarify is system prompt versus caching, because Omar, I think you've said both in this conversation. So can you break down where you system prompt and where you cache?
Cache, I don't.
I mean, sorry, context, not cache.
Oh, okay. So system prompt it's something. It's more of the project. Like a Claude Pro has something called projects. So that's what I mean by system prompt is where it's like set the project instructions. So that's like that's the project instructions, and then in the project, I'll load in the function files that I'm working on for context. So those are the two separators. The system prompt is the instructions that ground the session that we're having, and then the context is the function files.
I see. Okay, I have I just have one question, and then I'll let the Clarity Text team ask questions. So this one's to you, Adam, because you mentioned that you're using Windsurf now, and that actually piques my curiosity because we've historically been using Cursor, but we last week just started using Windsurf. So what are your first impressions? Can you compare and contrast them and what they're useful for?
Yeah, so initially I would say Windsurf. It's good in that you don't really need to set up. I feel like I spent quite a lot of time to alter the cursor rules and to get things like tweaked as I kind of needed to. Whereas Windsurf, it doesn't really have that cursor rules equivalent from what I understand. But even without that, I can still get it to work very effectively. And yeah, similar to Omar, like I didn't really like the VS Code IDE in general. Like I'm coming from WebStorm, so I would have like a shortcut in WebStorm where I would Command L, and Command L would open the same file in Cursor, and then Command L again would then open the side chat. So essentially, I had a workflow where I was using WebStorm, then just Command L, open Cursor, and then the chat on the side was the same hotkey as well. I don't do that as often now, so I'm mainly just using I forget the name of it now. Too many names. But
Windsurf, yeah.
Windsurf, yeah. I call it Windstorm. So Windsurf. So yeah, overall, I'm finding Windsurf is kind of the replacement for Cursor for me. Yeah, is there things that you have found yourself in terms of like the 1 week exposure to Windsurf?
Athul, you've been working with Windsurf for a little bit. Do you have any thoughts on Windsurf?
Yeah, I've been working with Windsurf for quite a while now, and I mean, I've been using Cursor and Windsurf simultaneously for working on the Spaces thing. And what I liked about Windsurf was that Windsurf was more, uh, it was getting the job done better than Cursor when it came to designing UIs and writing specific models. And I read that Windsurf is getting praised about that a lot in the community. That it tries it when it comes to Cursor, you have the ability to attach images and try to attach specific files, and you can get your job done with more specific things when it comes to backend. But Windsurf was more efficient in doing the UI for us. So, I mean, I got better results in generating UI with Windsurf.
Yeah.
Yeah, same here.
And
it seems.
Go ahead, Adam.
It seems to also do a bit of like reasoning. It looks like when it's doing the prompt. So I'm not sure if there's some reasoning part of like Claude Sonnet or not, or if it's like using O1 or something there. But it does seem to have some good reasoning to do multi-file edits really well. So the multi-file edits is I would say is a bit more improved on Windsurf.
Yeah, I think with our team, like getting just the right Tailwind classes is going to be critical for us, because I think that's going to be the most tedious part of our jobs coming up pretty soon. Atul, go ahead. You were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, as you said that, like in Windsurf, what the best thing was, it really took some approach on its own. But like in Cursor, you have to attach files and you have to wait for the right thing to get done for the specific files which you attached. But when it came to Windsurf, uh, spec- which I observed was when I gave it the prompt, it tried to generate its own files and it tried to work the whole thing through. Like it was able to build the projects on its own, save the files, and run it for me, rather than just cursor giving me the output, and it's up to me that how I implement it. So Windsurf was kind of more straightforward than Cursor. Windsurf was kind of doing a lot more of my work than Cursor did it for me.
Okay, interesting.
Put another way, I think there's not really anything that Windsurf doesn't do well. I would say, excluding maybe web search. I don't think it really has the ability to pull in like custom docs or the latest docs as easily as Cursor. That's the only small drawback, but everything else, I think it surpasses Cursor.
So how do you get the context of convex documentation into Windsurf?
Well, it's not really needed because it's part of the LLM, which is quite recent anyway. So I think it's kind of good enough, and I have all my patterns kind of in .md files. So examples are really key. I think Omar, have you found the same? Like where you give examples like that pretty heavily? Because I tend to use examples a lot to say this is the desired pattern that I would like to have the code like written in.
Yeah, definitely. I would say once you have your patterns established, you really don't have to reference the convex docs. In the beginning, um, sometimes it will do things incorrectly, and I'll use I'll just like if I'm working on a HTTP action, I'll just put in the whole um, you know doc for that, and once those patterns are established, I really don't need to keep telling it has to be this way. The only thing I found was whatever is not in the LLM, which is specifically convex auth. That's what I had to really let it know how that works, because it's just not in there. But yeah, just to reiterate, it's really good with working with the patterns you've established in your project. Definitely.
And when you two say examples, are you talking about, hey, this is my repo and it's implied what I'm trying to do? Or are you actually going into, say, Omar, your markdown file and writing out like, this is how I want to do my queries, or like very explicitly in a module saying, this is an example?
No, so I'm not having to say this is an example only when it's tripping up, and I need to ground it and say, stop doing it like this. This is how it's done. That's the only time
Okay.
where I'm being explicit. Otherwise, it just infers the patterns based on what's there and really sticks to it 9 out of 10 times.
I see. So in your ad hoc prompt, that's where you're putting in an example.
Yeah, when it
Right.
needs it. When I see that it's giving me incorrect things, like it's not doing an internal function correctly. It's like, let's say it's not putting internal, just for a really simplistic take.
I think that works well if you've got good consistency across your code base. I'm refactoring a lot of my code base from some different code patterns, so the LLM can't always like infer the correct like approach. So having like a .md file that essentially is labeled or named like convex mutation, and anytime a convex mutation is needed, then it can usually pick up that file, or I'll explicitly at the convex-mutation.md file, which is kind of a similar, maybe a summary or basically the convex docs essentially, but with my specific examples in there of my patterns that usually are the same as the docs, but probably have some additional patterns in there that are kind of my personal preference of how I'd like to have it to implement the code.
Okay. And
Yeah, I
here's
think just to say, I think the earlier you establish patterns that you want for the life cycle of the project, the better your experience is going to be. Because otherwise, the LLM will like fill in those things, and later you're gonna, if you're not grounding it with patterns from the beginning, later when you're going through refactoring, you're gonna see inconsistencies that just make things
Yeah, totally
tedious.
agree.
Like things like using just like simple things like using snake case here, using Pascal case here, and it's just things like when you go and like retroactively fix, you just say to yourself, I should have just established this from the beginning. So uh, I think you should establish as many patterns as you can at the start, and I'm talking about for like new projects that you're starting off with the Claude.
Yeah, but in terms of referencing the docs as well, I think in addition to like basically having the patterns and the documentation like in one file, I think is really helpful. So same with like shadcn components, like I'll copy the docs, but maybe I'll have customized that shadcn button to add like a loading state or something like that maybe doesn't come out of the box, and so my usage examples will include one of an example use case of that as like just a code snippet in the MD file to show how it's being used. So yeah, more and more I'm kind of referencing my own internal knowledge base as opposed to calling out to the internet to kind of get the latest version, or like kind of get that internet docs.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned shadcn because this is actually a immediate problem that we have because we paid for Tailwind UI, and if it's a competitor
Yeah,
to
same.
shadcn components, and it's like
Yep.
200 or so React code components, how
Yep.
do you recommend that we get this into like I don't even know quite how to articulate this, into our context or RAG or someplace else, because right now what we're doing is like at our top level directory path in our project, we have like Tailwind UI, and then we just paste our paid product into like these directories for Tailwind UI, and we mention those files and hope that the Windsurf or AI tool will like recognize that. But I think it's like mixed results in success. So how would you go about doing that?
So just to understand what you're trying to do, are you trying to stick with Tailwind UI and use those example paid components that you have in your project, or are you trying to use shadcn? Like which are you trying to do?
A Tailwind UI. So like for example, we have a combo box from the Tailwind UI. We want to use it, but
yeah. So
you can't just copy and
again,
paste it, right?
yeah. So I think it's also trying to strategically think about how to build for the AI era. Because I've also paid for Tailwind UI, and I've chosen to use shadcn instead. And so the reason is because I feel there's a lot more knowledge base already existing, and I can tap into that via the LLM using shadcn. So I kind of see shadcn as like the LLM way of building. So I much rather go on the upward trajectory and kind of ride the wave that's increasing in size, as opposed to trying to fight a bit of a customized approach, even though I've kind of had this I've got this sunk cost fallacy of I've paid for this and I want to make use of it. And I do use some components from Tailwind UI as well, but the majority of my code base now is like shadcn, and then it's filled in with the Tailwind UI kind of as needed. But yeah, you can take the approach of using sort of more Tailwind or more of like a closed system. But anytime you start to use a closed system, there's a lot more work on your side to, um, have the LLM pull in the right information, and yeah, you'll have to create sort of those custom .md files that you can then have examples in, and then pull in basically when you want to do a combo box, or maybe you always have that in the context. That could work too.
Yeah, and with ShadCN, you have you get a directory of these components in your code as essentially a zip file. So how do you feed that into an AI tool? Is it just context, or do you save the files to your repo and mention them? How do you actually make the prompt?
Well, the thing with ShadCN is the LLMs are so good at using ShadCN out of the box. Like, I don't really need to give it any custom instructions, which is great. Even if I'm using another tool, like if I use Bolt.new or something, or just like want a UI in general, I generally kind of defaults to ShadCN. So it's kind of one of the reasons I think, again, to adopt the ShadCN is it's so widely adopted by the LLM knowledge base that you're really kind of going with the flow there. So it's only kind of when you start to deviate from the general bulk of the knowledge that the internet has, and I think that's the thing with the open source content is that because it's not closed, it sort of builds more and more momentum from the LLM usage, and then LLM generated code inherently has more of this sort of open code in it in the generation. So you're kind of really going with the momentum, I think, if you're building on the open LLM knowledge base. It's like having your employees, if you think of the LLM as an employee, it's like all your employees and like knowledgeable in ShadCN. Like, do you want to use ShadCN, or do you want to teach everyone some other new tool? So it just comes at a cost, I guess.
Yeah, that pre-training aspect is an important factor. We have 5 minutes left on the meeting, so I want to give the chance to my team to ask any questions. Sorry about hogging so much time. Anyone from the CT team?
Yeah, I when Omar told that he uses CodeBuff with the Claude web UI framework, so I want to know, how do you use both of those things hand in hand? Like, what's the relationship you build with CodeBuff and Claude? Like, I don't. You said that you don't use anything like Cursor or Windsor, which already has Claude in it.
Yeah,
So how do you keep those things hand in hand?
yeah, definitely. So basically, the way I'm using it is that I'm having essentially Claude write the prompts to tell CodeBuff what to do. Um, because you know Claude is just more meticulous, and honestly,
Me?
I'm offloading cognitive processing to Claude. So, like I said, what I do is I say to Claude, "Okay, Claude, we're done here, and I'm gonna take I want to I want you to write a detailed summary." This is specifically what I say to Claude. I say, "I want you to give me a detailed summary that I can hand off to another engineer for implementation." Because, like I said, I go through that back and forth with Claude to figure out what needs to be done. So then after we do that, then I get that summary and that implementation details, just copy and paste into CodeBuff, and it does the work. So it's like analogous to, you have a meeting with senior engineers, and you're talking high level what you need to do, get a little bit mid level, and then those senior engineers go off and have the juniors and other seniors implement. But it's like me and Claude are doing the high level meeting, and then CodeBuff is doing the actual implementation. And I'm only doing that because Claude doesn't have access to editing my files directly, and while CodeBuff does.
Okay, great. That was helpful.
Go ahead, Adam.
Sorry, just conscious of the time. I just wanted to know one quick question around like bolt.new, if you got it to work with convex or not, because it's a key sticking point that I'm not sure about how you'd get it to work. Because I think you mentioned somewhere in Discord that you're able to get the bolt.new working with convex, and I'm just wondering how if that's possible, and yeah, maybe we can continue the conversation if it's a bit of a lengthy one.
Oh yeah, the convex team said that they were going to work on getting the GitHub authentication working. I haven't heard back about that, but I don't think it's going to be possible because I looked at Bolt uses web containers, and um, you know, based on the way web containers is set up, it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to arbitrarily open up a GitHub authentication link. I don't think it's gonna get that far with web containers.
Okay.
Because you know how we log into Convex through the terminal because we have to go through GitHub, right? It doesn't seem like
Yeah.
it can open up the GitHub in there, the HTTP.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Just one quick tip I wrote down that I wanted to give you guys. Look, if you're stuck on a problem where the model is providing you implementation after implementation that continues to fail, what I found is take a deep breath, and then you tell it to relax and give you the most simplest implementation. And many times it'll give you the simplest implementation and it'll solve the problem. And I think it's when you have such a long context that increased complexity leads to Claude giving you more complex solutions than it should be. So telling it to keep it simple can be very helpful.
All right, sounds good. We covered a lot of ground. I think our meeting is coming to a close, but Omar, thanks so much for joining, and Adam, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite. Appreciate it.
We're in the early innings of our team, so this is pretty exciting, and glad that we have you as our first guest speakers.
Awesome. All right, guys. Bye.
Thanks.